Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is our final chapter of Shaking the Nickel Bush. No, no, you can't.
I want a blanket.
You're under a blanket. This is chapter 19, and it's called So Long, Buddy. The show was a good one, and I stayed through to see the cowboy and Indian picture twice, even though I wasn't in the horse falls. It was about midnight when I got back to our room, and I chuckled out loud when I noticed that Lonnie's saddle, outfit, and bedroll were missing. It hadn't occurred to me that he might hawk his bedroll because it wouldn't bring much more than $2, old as it was. I'd started to take off my tie before I noticed a sheet of hotel writing paper lying on the desk. I knew I hadn't left it there, and Lonnie had never written a letter in all the time I'd known him, so I was a bit curious, but not for long. In printed letters big enough that I could read them at 6 feet, Lonnie had written, "So long, buddy. I couldn't leave Shiftless go, so I have took off. Lonnie." I couldn't help laughing aloud when I read it. No wonder Lonnie had been fidgeting in the theater. He'd been sitting on the horns of a dilemma trying to decide which way to jump. For weeks he'd been looking forward to a big time in Kansas City, and those two chickadees he'd chirped to had almost set him afire. But I'd probably frightened him a little more than I'd realized at supper, and he was afraid I'd put the pressure on even harder when morning came. In his childish way, he figured that his only hope of saving Shiftless was to pawn his outfit and head straight for Wyoming on the money he got for it. But Lonnie had made lots of good resolutions before, just as he did in Santa Fe, and they'd lasted only long enough for him to see a skirt flapping in the breeze. He'd have done well if he'd gone a block after pawning his outfit without chirping chick, chick, chick at some chickadee. Before daylight, he'd be tiptoeing into our room, dead broke and full of excuses. I was still chuckling as I undressed, hung my suit coat over the back of a chair, and started to lay my breeches out smoothly on the dresser. It was only then that I missed the bust I'd made of Lonnie as a sample to show prospective customers. Next to Shiftless, it was his most prized possession. He usually took it with him when he went to ride the girls around, and he always claimed to have made it himself because he'd poured the plaster for the casting. For a month he'd been talking about taking it home to show his folks, and he'd had it standing on the dresser when we went out to supper. I was glad he'd taken it along, for I was sure he could never resist the temptation of finding some girl to show it to and brag of its being a self-portrait. When I went to bed, I left the light on in the bathroom and the door open a couple of inches, so he wouldn't stumble over a chair or something and wake me when he came in. I hadn't slept in a bed since leaving Santa Fe, and I must have gone to sleep the moment my head touched the pillow. It was broad daylight when I woke, and a stream of sunshine was pouring in through the window. For a minute or two, I just lay there, yawning, stretching, and enjoying the softness of the mattress. Then I realized that Lonnie hadn't come back. Everything was just as I'd left it when I went to bed, and the light was still on in the bathroom. I didn't believe for a moment that Lonnie had left town, but I wished I hadn't been quite so rough on him at supper time. I might have frightened him enough that he didn't dare come back after a night on the town, for fear I'd force him into selling Shiftless. I was just a little bit ashamed of myself, and disappointed. Of course, we'd planned to split up in Kansas City anyway, but I did want to say goodbye to him and wish him luck and get his folks' address so I could write to him. Then, too, I didn't want to go away and leave him stranded, and he certainly would be after an evening of playing big shot for the girls. The only thing he'd have left to pawn would be his suit, and that wouldn't bring more than $2 or $3, only enough to buy his breakfast and 1 tank of gas for Shiftless. For maybe 10 minutes I lay there in bed, wishing I'd told Lonnie my plan for having him drive me to Littleton, and trying to figure out what he'd probably have done and how I'd better go about finding him. Just as soon as he'd picked up a girl to take riding, he'd have taken Shiftless out of the garage where we'd parked her. But if I'd frightened him enough that he didn't dare come back to the hotel, he wouldn't risk putting her back in that garage. He'd park her someplace where he could sleep in her till noon, and then he'd hawk his suit, blow in whatever he got for it, and go hunting for a job. When I'd figured things out that far, the rest seemed easy. I'd find him at the stockyards, and that's where he'd always hung out before we teamed up and bought Shiftless, and that's where he'd have to go to hunt a job, and that's where he'd be sleeping in her. There was no need of rushing right down there. He'd sleep until I woke him, and if we didn't get started for Littleton before noon, it would be all right. We could easily make up the lost time by driving late into the evening. I lay in bed a few minutes longer, spent half an hour soaking in a warm bath, scrubbed myself with a rough towel until I was tingling all over, and went to the closet for my blue shirt and Levi's. There would be no sense in wearing my good suit down to the stockyards. I was thinking about Littleton and the roundup and didn't notice that the Levi's weren't mine until I'd stepped into them and hauled them up. They were at least 4 inches too big around the waist and the bottoms of the cuffs only to the calves of my legs. For a second or two my mouth went dry as ashes, and then I couldn't help laughing. Poor old Lonnie, he must have been afraid I'd smell a mouse when he failed to come back from the men's room, and that I might catch up with him before he got his stuff out of the hotel. He probably never turned the light on when he came into the room, but left the door open while he snatched the first shirt and pair of Levi's he got his hands on, then grabbed up his bedroll, bust, outfit, and gotten out of there as fast as he could. There was little doubt that he'd been playing big shot for some girl all evening, and had finally had to tell them he was broke, while all the time my britches with $700 in the cuffs were lying on Shiftless's back seat. Small as the doubt was, it was enough to make me uneasy. I wasn't a bit worried for fear Lonnie had taken my Levi's intentionally, but I was worried for fear someone else might have done it. While he took girls to a show or into some shop to buy them presents or ice cream, he'd have left Shiftless in the street, and if he were asleep in her down at the stockyards, I could be in real trouble. There were always a lot of down-and-out bums hanging around the yard, and any one of them could swipe a shirt and pair of jeans if he could get away with them. And Lonnie wouldn't wake up if they swiped the hat off his head. My hands weren't too steady when I pulled all the money I had left, $2.85 from the pocket of my suit breeches, hauled the belt out of the loops, reefed Lonnie's Levi's around my waist, and turned down one fold of the cuffs. On my way out of the hotel, I stopped at the desk and left word that Lonnie should wait for me if he came in while I was away. Then after I'd caught a streetcar for the stockyards, I knew that stopping had been a waste of time. Even if Lonnie would discover he'd taken the wrong pair of Levi's, he wouldn't bring them back in exchange after my having scared him about Shiftless. He'd never guessed there was anything in the cuffs, so he'd simply throw them away or trade them to some bum who had a pair that were too big for him. All the way to the stockyards, I told myself what a fool I'd been for putting the pressure on Lonnie. And I told it to myself at least 50 more times as I spent the day searching every alley around the cattle pens and inquiring at every office and weighing shack. But nobody had seen either Lonnie or a 1914 Ford of Shiftless's description. By late afternoon, it occurred to me that Lonnie might have got in over his head the night before. If he'd spied up a couple of girls like those chickadees he'd spied when we came out of the restaurant, they could have led him into enough trouble that he might have been arrested. He wouldn't have any better sense than to let them take him to some gyp joint and run up a bill he wouldn't be able to pay. The more I thought of it, the more it seemed to me that it might be all for the best. If he were in jail, I could find him easily enough, and the cost of bailing him out and getting him squared away would be small compared to the amount in the cuffs on my Levi's. Then he couldn't raise any objection to leaving town and driving me to Littleton. By driving straight through, we could still make it in plenty of time for the roundup. I'd already spent 50 cents calling the hotel to find out if Lonnie had shown up, and by dusk I had only a quarter left. I'd spent the rest of my $2.85 calling every police station in both Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas, but there was no record of either Lonnie or Shiftless anywhere. I'd called the last station before I'd admit to myself that I might have misjudged Lonnie right from the time he left me in the theater, that he might actually have headed for home as soon as he pawned his outfit. If he had, he'd certainly left me stranded worse than I'd thought he would be. I already owed an $8 hotel bill, and if I pawned everything I had, it wouldn't leave me enough to buy a railroad ticket to Littleton. On the way back from the stockyards, I thought of something I should have thought about first thing that morning. There was a pretty sure way of finding out whether or not Lonnie had really left Kansas City. If he had been alone when he went out to the garage for Shiftless, he'd probably driven straight out of town. If there'd been a girl with him, he'd still be hiding out somewhere in the city where I could find him. I went right to the garage from the streetcar, and when I got there, the night man had just come on duty. When I asked him if he remembered Lonnie's coming in, whether or not he was alone, he said, "Yup, he was alone, lugging a bedroll and a statue rolled up in a pair of blue jeans. Only the hair was sticking out at the end. That's how come I remember him so well. Seemed to be in an awful hurry. Asked me the best road to St. Joe and how to get onto it." "What did he do with the statue?" I asked. "Laid it on the back seat real careful," he told me, "and wedged it into a corner with his bedroll so's it wouldn't jiggle off and get busted." "What had he, stole it someplace?" "No," I said, "it was his. Did you notice what time it was when he came in?" "About an hour later than this," he told me. "Not long after I come on duty." "Why, wasn't the flivver his? He had the claim check for it." "Yes, it's his," I said. "He's a friend of mine, and I just wondered if he'd left town yet." Then I got out of there before he could ask me any more questions. It appeared certain that I'd frightened Lonnie out of Kansas City, but knowing where he was bound for made me positive that I could overtake him. I'd never before known him to leave city with so much as a dime in his pocket, and I didn't believe he could do it twice in a row. Without me to watch after him in St. Joe, he'd be bound to get mixed up with some chickadee and go broke. Sooner or later, he'd probably mooch enough gas to go on, but it might take him 2 or 3 days, and if I got up there soon enough, I'd find him around the stockyards. From the garage, I hurried right back to the hotel, picked up my saddle and outfit, and wasted an hour lugging them to half the pawnshops on 12th Street. Every pawnbroker knew the saddle for an off-sized Oregon half-breed the moment he saw it, and the best I could get for the whole outfit was $10. Much as I'd wanted to go back to Littleton looking prosperous, there was only one thing I could do. I had to go back to the hotel, pay my bill, and take everything else I owned to the pawn shop. I didn't have any better luck with the rest of my stuff than I did with the saddle. The suitcase had been scuffed up from jouncing around in Shiftless. My suit was too small for anyone but a skinny boy to wear. My bedroll looked a bit tacky, and the pawnbroker didn't even know what my sculpturing tools were. All I could do was to keep the best and smallest tools and take $5 for the rest of the stuff. I couldn't afford to waste time in trying to hop freight, so I went to the depot, struck up an acquaintance with some of the boomers hanging around, and asked where there would be a mail train going to St. Joseph. They said the Denver mail train pulled out at 11 o'clock and St. Joe was its first stop, but there was no use in trying to hop the blind baggage on any mail train leaving Kansas City. They all left from the main depot, and the railroad police watched the front end like bloodhounds. One of the boys said he'd help me by making a run for the front mail car just before the train pulled out. Then, while the cops were chasing him away, I could duck underneath and climb up onto the rods. To me, that sounded 10 times more dangerous than riding horse falls, so I decided to buy a ticket and ride the earlier train, but all it left me was a pocket full of small change. I wanted to reach St. Joe early enough to check the stockyards, and if I didn't find Lonnie there, make a round of every garage, movie theater, and ice cream parlor that evening. But the only train I could get out of Kansas City was a local that stopped at every flag station along the way. The Denver mail train went zooming past us at the last flag stop and was standing in the St. Joseph depot when we pulled in. It blocked my way to the stockyards, so I hurried up the track to go around it. I'd nearly reached the engine when a railroad cop with a revolver slung at his hip stopped me. He made me stand where I was and watched me like a weasel until the train was pulling out so fast that I couldn't have flipped it if I'd wanted to. When I got over to the stockyards, it was easy to see that cowhand jobs were as scarce in the north as they had been in the south. There were 3 or 4 down and outers sleeping in every little feed pile. None of them had saddles, and less than half of them had bedrolls. I waked a boy at each feed pile, asked him how long he'd been around the yards, and if he'd seen a Ford like Shiftless or a boy who might have been Lonnie. No one had, and I knew it must be nearly 2 o'clock before I'd searched out every feed pile in the yard, so I lay down by one of them for a few hours' sleep. I was out before daylight, and by 11 o'clock that night I'd been to every garage and gasoline station from one end of St. Joseph to the other. I hadn't missed a single movie theater, ice cream parlor, or restaurant, but no one had seen a sign of Lonnie. Even though I'd been living on peanuts and canned salmon, I was down to my last dime, so there seemed nothing I could do but go down to the depot and try my luck at flipping the midnight train for Denver. If I made it, I could still reach Littleton before the roundup was over, and once there I knew I wouldn't have any trouble finding a job. To kill a little time, I stopped at each garage I came to on my way to the depot, just in the hope I might find some nightman who hadn't been on duty when I made my first round. I found the right one when I had only a couple of blocks left to go. He was an old fellow sitting in front of a little garage on a side street. "Yeah, I seen him," he said when I described Lonnie and Shiftless. "Kind of a chunky-set boy wearing a light gray suit with a dark pencil stripe. He was driving a 1914 Ford that looked close to new. Arizona license plate. Stopped here to gas up last night before last. About midnight, I recollect. Lost his way coming into town is how he got way off over here. Asked how to get back on the road for Sioux City." "Was he alone?" I asked. "Yeah, alone," he told me. "Nice friendly sort of a boy. Clever, too. Cowboy artist, said he was. Had a likeness he'd made of his own self, spittin' image of him." "Did he have it wrapped up?" I asked. Yeah, in a blue shirt and a pair of overalls. He was taking it home, present for his ma. Is he kin of yours?" "No," I said, "just a friend. I'd hoped to meet him while he was in town." "Don't reckon he stopped over to see nobody," the old man said. "Told me he had nigh on to 800 miles to make and aimed to do it in 3 days. Ought to be close to home by now." "Did he say where his home was?" I asked. "Not that I recollect. Didn't ask him." "Hope he makes it okay," I said. "Didn't seem sort of cash, did he?" "Wouldn't know about that," he said. "Paid for his gas out of a 10, so he couldn't have been too hard up." "Did he have a saddle and cowhand outfit in the flivver?" The old man shook his head. "None that I seen, not lest it was on the floor in the back. All I seen was a bedroll in the likeness I was telling you of." There was no sense in asking any more questions, and even less sense in trying to follow Lonnie any further, so I headed for the railroad tracks. I didn't go to the depot, but circled around a couple of blocks to the north, crossed the tracks, and hid in a ditch a couple of yards beyond the place where the engine of the Denver mail train had stopped the night before. It was nearly half an hour before the train pulled in, and as I waited for it, I had the chance to do some of the thinking I should have done before getting myself into any such fix. There was nobody to blame but myself. I thought I was pretty smart when I'd been sitting there in the restaurant and putting the pressure on Lonnie to sell shiftless. If I'd stopped to do a little thinking before passing out all my wise advice, I might have known what would happen. Lonnie had been in love with old Shiftless since the first day he'd seen her, and his affection had never cooled for a moment, not even when we discovered how worn out and worthless she was. As I lay there in the ditch, I could almost see him again up there in the mountains when we sheared off the half-moon key. Lazy as he was about everything else, he'd started off the next morning for a new key, knowing he might have to walk 80 miles to town and back, rather than run the risk of my abandoning the old wreck. I might have known that he cared more for that old flivver than for all the girls in the world, and that his taking them to ride had been more for a chance to show off Shiftless than for any other reason. Even though Lonnie had taken my Levi's by mistake, $700 in all, I hadn't really lost anything yet. There wasn't the slightest doubt that he was headed straight for home, whatever that may be. Unless he ran into a lot of bad luck on the way, the money he got for his outfit would be enough to see him through. And when he got there, my Levi's would still be wrapped around the plaster bust I'd made for him. He might throw the breeches away because they were too small for him or needed washing, but his mother wouldn't, and she wouldn't wash them without unfolding the cuffs. I might not know where to find Lonnie, but he knew I was going to Littleton and that I had plenty of friends there. He might swipe chickens and mooch a little to spend on the girls, but I knew him well enough to know that when my $700 was discovered, he'd get it back to me one way or another. The more I thought of it, the more I realized that I wouldn't have lost anything, even though my $700 were never found and returned. Less than 8 months ago, the specialists at the Boston hospital had given me only 6 months to live, but I was still alive, and I'd never felt healthier in my life. In the past 2 months, I'd gained 5 pounds, and Mother had written that Dr. Gagan was very pleased with my progress. More than that, in a time when thousands of stout, healthy men were out of jobs and having to queue up in soup lines or take charity to feed their families, I'd been making money so fast I didn't dare let my mother find out about it. With what I'd sent to Grace, the family would be safe for a year, even if I didn't send home another dime. There was no fear of that. I had my sculpting tools in my hip pocket, and my eye and hand were well practiced in the way to use them. The mail train pulled in while I was thinking back over the months that Lonnie and I had spent together. I lay flat and didn't even let myself think until the mail sacks had been tossed aboard. The conductor swung his lantern and my wheels began turning. I jumped to my feet and made my run at the instant the headlight passed me, and I was at full running speed when I grabbed the handbar on the front end of the first mail car and flipped aboard. There was nothing to slow me down, for all I was carrying was 1 dime, the little Bible that had been my father's, and my sculpting tools. The railroad cop who had stopped me the night before was on duty again. He must have been in the service and couldn't have been out long enough to forget his army training. He shouted, "Halt!" before I'd taken 5 steps, and I heard the whiz of a bullet before I heard the bark of his gun. The shot was either wild or intentionally high. It didn't even hit the train, but it did make my nerves jumpy for a few seconds. The mail train had picked up full speed before I could settle down comfortably in the deep blind doorway of the mail car, knowing that no conductor or brakie could reach me, and that there was no danger of the train stopping till it was far, far along the rails toward Littleton and the 4th of July roundup. And there's a picture of Ralphie with a horse. There they are.
Why did they try to shoot him?
Because he was hopping onto a train car where he wasn't supposed to be riding and he hadn't bought any tickets. That's why.
But they can't buy a ticket to get on one.
No, people aren't allowed to ride on that train.
I don't think that's a new chapter, Mom.
That's the end of the chapter. It's all over.
The book's over?
Book's over. Book's over. That's it.
Book's over.
Stop. So, that's the end.